In the Footsteps of Crazy Horse, Chapter 5, The Tongue River Valley. Jimmy said very little as they turned to the Interstate 25 and headed north. He was still thinking about the story of the Battle of 100 in the Hands. Why didn't they call it 100 in the Hands? He asked suddenly. His grandfather smiled. Before the battle happened, a Cheyenne holy man predicted a victory in a battle against 100 men. He said the warriors were holding 100 in the hands. That meant a victory. The interesting part is that there were 80 soldiers who came out to the fort that morning. The holy man's prediction was close. Jimmy sat quietly until they reached the town of Sheridan. There, Grandpa Niles took an exit and then turned onto a narrow highway that went north out of town. "We're going to take a look at the Tongue River Valley," he explained. "Most of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people who were here had villages in that valley." In less than 15 minutes they came near to the river. On either side of it were broken hills. The grass was sparse but green, and there were sagebush everywhere. Its gray leaves brightened the hillsides and the meadows along the river. "This looks nice," Jimmy commented. "Beautiful country," Grandfather agreed. Crazy Horse liked it here a lot. This was the western end of the Lakota Territory, which started at the Missouri River in the east. He wanted to live here for the rest of his life. His Ogallala people were here when he was born, so he grew up around here. "Maybe I will live here some day," Jimmy declared. After they had driven for a while, Jimmy spoke again. "Crazy Horse sure was in a lot of places. Way in Nebraska, Fort Laramie, and now here. For sure, but this is where he spent most of his childhood, in what is now central and northern central Wyoming. It wasn't Wyoming then, of course. So what happened here?" "A lot," answered Grandpa Niles. "He lost his birth mother. He learned how to ride horses, used to make weapons, be a hunter and a warrior. Had his first girlfriend." "Cool. Well, except for the girlfriend part." "Hey, don't knock it," his grandfather said, grinning and glancing at him. "It'll happen to you one day. But there was one thing he did that I thought was really cool." "He learned to shoot bows and arrows?" "Yes, but what I'm talking about is hunting. Starting as a young teenager, he was a really good hunter. He pulled the truck over to the shoulder of the road and stopped. Lots of elk and deer around here, so it was fun to be a hunter. But the best thing he did was supply meat for the old people and for the widows." "Really?" "Yeah, he sure did. And nobody told him to do that. He decided on his own to do it because his parents and his family told him it was good to take care of the helpless ones. So he would kill an elk or a deer and bring it back for a family that didn't have a hunter. You know, the old people or the women who had lost their husbands and still had children to care for. He would just leave the meat at the lodge door for someone who needed it." Jimmy was intrigued. He thought for a moment and then said, "I can do that." "You can, and you will one day," Grandpa Niles predicted, "long as you understand that Crazy Horse didn't do it because he wanted people to notice. He didn't even want people to thank him. He just didn't want anyone to go hungry. Because he cared, right?" Grandpa Niles smiled. "Yeah, you got that right. Later in his life, after he got married, he and his wife would give away their food. He would give away his horses so that people could ride and haul their belongings." "Wow!" "Yeah, giving away a horse in those days was like giving away a car today. You don't know anyone who would give away a car, do you?" Jimmy shook his head. "No, I guess Crazy Horse was a generous person." Grandpa Niles smiled broadly. "I'm glad you know that word, and yes, he was very generous. That was one of the things all Lakota people were taught to be, generous." He put the truck in gear and drove back to the road. After a mile or so he turned onto a gravel road that mostly followed the river. There were many broad meadows on either side, good places that could hold lots of lodges. They drove into an area with a sign that read "Public Fishing." Getting out, they walked towards the river. A warm breeze swayed in the grasses and the shrubs near the banks. Overhead, the hawks soared on the air currents. Somehow, or somewhere nearby, the meadowlark and a red-winged blackbird sang in their bright, cheery songs. Jimmy could understand why Crazy Horse loved this place. In his mind, he could see lodges in the meadow on the other side. "Grandpa, did Crazy Horse marry his girlfriend?" No, Grandfather replied, a bit sadly. She was given away to someone else. That broke his heart. Her name was Black Buffalo Woman. Later, though, Crazy Horse married a woman named Black Shawl. Given away? What do you mean? In those days, a girl's parents had a lot of control over who she married. Black Buffalo Woman's father listened to someone who didn't like Crazy Horse, so he gave her to another young man. But Black Shawl was a good woman. She and Crazy Horse were devoted to each other. They had a daughter. Jimmy nodded quietly. Grandpa Niles said sadly, "But they lost that little girl. She got sick with a disease called cholera. She died from it, and she was only 4 years old." Sad things happened to him a lot, didn't they? For sure, Grandpa Niles said, sighing. His birth mother died. One of his second mothers died later, and he lost his best friend and then his daughter. Like you said, lots of sad things. Did he cry? He sure did, especially when his little girl died. He stayed at her burial scaffold for days. He didn't eat, didn't drink water, just cried and cried. I saw my dad cry once, Jimmy remembered, when my uncle died. It's hard to lose anyone we love. Your dad lost his brother. They were very close. He cried because he was grieving, just like Crazy Horse did. Jimmy looked across the river. There were birds flying and landing in the low willow shrubs. Nearby, insects were buzzing. I guess even tough guys cry, huh, Grandpa? Grandpa nodded, glancing down at his grandson. Yeah, when things like that happen, like to your dad and Crazy Horse, it's okay for tough guys to cry. Don't you ever forget that. Jimmy nodded. I won't, Grandpa. Good. His grandfather waved his arm. So you can see why Crazy Horse liked this area, he said. In 1877, when the United States government told him he had to live on a reservation, he said he wanted that reservation to be here. Was it, Grandpa? No, I think the government promised him his own reservation just to talk him into surrendering. Jimmy frowned. That wasn't very nice. No, it wasn't. But I brought you here because this is where Crazy Horse spent the last of his life, or the last year of his life. Oh, wow, Jimmy replied, as a feeling of sadness went through him. Of course, he didn't know it would be the last year of his life, Grandpa Niles quickly pointed out. He was more concerned with the hard winter that year and for the future. The future? The Lakota and the Northern Cheyenne had won a great battle against the Long Knives in June of 1876 at Little Bighorn. Because of that, the United States government was angry and wanted badly to put Crazy Horse and his people on a reservation. Sitting Bull and his people, too. That winter, 1876 and 77, were very hard in a lot of different ways. Jimmy knew about the Battle of Little Bighorn. Grandpa Niles talked about it a lot, but he hadn't talked much about what happened after the battle. What do you mean? He asked. How was it hard? Well, it was a cold winter without much food, Grandpa Niles explained. The buffalo were all gone. White hunters had come for many years and killed them for their tongues and their hides, for sport, eventually killed most of the buffalo, so it was hard to find enough food to feed everyone. Ammunition for the guns was scarce and hard to get. Long Knives attacked them and burnt down what little food they did have. On top of all that, most of the Lakota had already surrendered. Men like Red Cloud and Spotted Tail were telling Crazy Horse and his people they should surrender to the whites too. If they didn't surrender, the Long Knives would kill or capture them all. Geez, Grandpa, that was bad. Crazy Horse did a lot of thinking, spent a lot of time alone, Grandpa Niles went on. He didn't want to surrender. No one did. But the scary thing was, if they didn't starve to death, the soldiers would eventually come. There were hundreds and hundreds of them, with plenty of guns and bullets. Crazy Horse only had 128 warriors. He did surrender, didn't he? Yeah, he had to. He was worried most about the helpless ones. You know, the widows, the old people, the children. Grandpa Niles put a hand on Jimmy's shoulder. He and his warriors could die fighting the whites, but who would take care of the helpless ones after that? Who would protect them? Crazy Horse and his council of old men decided it was better to live under the control of the whites and stick together and get through it somehow. He gazed out across the land. They decided to surrender, to leave this place. But they won the last battle. You said so, Jimmy protested. They did. They won the last two battles, Grandpa Niles said, a serious look on his face. He pointed to the south. Over those hills was a battle that happened before Little Bighorn. Over there is Rosebud Creek. Crazy Horse led about 500 men more than 50 miles in the dark of the night, no moon. The next dawn they faced General George Crook's army, which had 3 times more men and a heck of a lot more guns and bullets. For reals? Yeah, the Rosebud Battle, the whites called it. We know it as the battle where the girl saved her brother. Jimmy was intrigued. Why? Because a young Cheyenne woman rode with the men where her brother's horse was or when her brother's horse was shot down, she raced to rescue him. Soldiers were shooting at her from 2 sides, but she still managed to save him. Jimmy's eyes were wide. Wow, awesome.